Good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of Star Opinion Live with the Kansas City Star Editorial Board. I'm your host today, Toriano Porter. I'm joined by Editorial Board colleague Michael Ryan. 1 week ago today, on our last show, we spoke with the family of Nevaeh Thomas and her mother, Brandy Stewart. Nevaeh is an 11-year-old black child that was struck by a 12-year-old in Johnson County, Kansas, with a pipe, allegedly. That young man has been charged in that crime. We wanted to bring Johnson County DA Steve Howe on the show today to kind of break down the juvenile justice system, the adult certification process, and give us an update on what's going on with that case and any other case of note in Johnson County. DA Howe, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. There's been a lot of talk the last 3 or 4 weeks about the alleged crime that occurred in Johnson County. Can you give us an update on the case involving the assault of Nevaeh Thomas?
Yeah, right now it's for scheduling hearing, and it's going to take a track that's maybe a little bit slower than normal because of the COVID-19 situation and the fact that our courthouse is closed to the public and is only doing hearings by virtual means. So the case is progressing as it normally is, but it's not in actually open court. And we have found that it is slowed down a little bit as a result of having to do everything by virtual.
Absolutely. And DA Howe, the juvenile justice system is different than the adult justice system, as it should be. Can you explain to us a little bit the difference between the juvenile code and the criminal code when it relates to hate crimes and alleged hate crimes?
Well, first of all, the code is the focus of the juvenile justice system is different than the adult system. And with the passing of Senate Bill 367 3 years ago, it really put an emphasis on rehabilitation. The goal is correcting behavior at the juvenile level, so therefore that person doesn't graduate into the adult system and become an adult offender. In the adult system, it's more punitive. But I will say, even in the adult system, there has been a turn to more rehabilitative and trying to change recidivism through other means other than incarceration. And so, but the juvenile system, more so than the adult system, it's all about rehabilitation. And there's also changes or there's differences in the sentencing structures and what can be done in those cases.
Yeah. And how does that relate to hate crimes? I understand there's no hate crime statute for juvenile offenders.
Yeah. So, this first came up when the Jewish Community Center shootings occurred, and then also at the Austin's Bar and Grill, about why Kansas doesn't have a hate crime. And one of the things that we talked about at that time was, under Kansas law, instead of having a hate crime, Kansas law allows for what we call aggravating circumstances, which could enhance or increase the penalties against an individual in the adult system. So like if you have a crime, let's say the aggravated battery, if you have a crime and let's say the sentence is presumed to be 3 years in length, you could file a departure motion, and that motion allows the judge to go up to double the normal sentence based on aggravating circumstances. And under the departure statute that I have here, which is KSA 216815, Section 2C specifically addresses motivations of the crime for race, color, religion, ethnicity, national origin, or sexual orientation. And so what the Kansas courts have done, instead of creating a specific crime, is it allows that to be shown during the sentencing phase to enhance the sentence. And quite frankly, I think that's a more effective tool for us because in most hate crimes, you have an underlying crime that has occurred. In Austin's Bar and Grill and the Jewish Community Center was a murder. Well, you can prove the murder. And then like in the Jewish Community Center shooting, we use that as the hate crime to be one of the factors for asking for the death penalty. And so you can do that, and I think it's a more effective tool. Instead of, if you have to prove a hate crime, you have to prove the motive of the individual in committing that offense, and that can be sometimes more difficult than just proving the I guess, core crime that actually occurred. And so I think Kansas has a unique way of going about it, but we kind of get to the same destination through a different means.
Steve, either in this case or any other case that you have seen in Johnson County, is there an inspiration in you to seek any changes in the law, either in the juvenile or in the adult system?
Well, I just talked about what we do in the adult system. The juvenile system is different in the fact that you don't necessarily have what was called departure criteria. Those statutes are for the adult system. So really the juvenile system, this type of incident, if it is racially motivated, it can be a factor that the court consider in imposing its sentence. And that can be either sending them to the youth correctional facility or giving them probation, the length of the sentence while the person is serving time. But it's more of a discretionary act by the court. And again, going back to the focus of the juvenile justice system, is supposed to be rehabilitation, not incarceration. So it's a little bit different. There's some nuances to it, but I would say that if we had a case and we were asking that a person be punished in the juvenile system and it was an egregious act that was race-based, then we can use that as a criteria for making a request from the court to do on the top end of the sentence that's possible.
And is there a time limit in the juvenile system that somebody can serve for something like that?
Yeah, it's basically up to the age of, I'm trying to remember, it's either 22 and a half or 23 and a half. That's their maximum sentence that they're allowed to go under the juvenile code, and then they would have to be released. And so, that's why they also have the waiver statutes in place where we can waive a person from the juvenile system into the adult system. But a person that is 12 years old is not eligible for that. And so you have to be over the age of 14 in order to be waived into the adult system. And I think it's back on the premise that the person is not mature enough to understand what they're doing, and putting a 12-year-old into the adult penitentiary is probably, even for the most conservative people, doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right. And I had a couple of points I wanted to touch on, DA Howe, before we move the conversation along. That 12-year-old in that alleged assault against Nevaeh, was that an aggravated assault or aggravated battery charge?
It's called aggravated battery.
Battery, okay. Okay, and the family was pushing for an attempted murder charge. How do you respond to that? Is that something that you're looking into?
Well, just like any case, we look at the particular facts and try to determine whether or not the crime fits the charge, whether the facts fit the charge. And we're really comfortable that based on the facts that we have, and I can't talk about the facts because it's a pending matter, that this is the appropriate charge based on the facts that we know of.
Right. And full disclosure, the family and I both agree on this. And this is an opinion that I'm expressing myself as a black man. It doesn't reflect the opinion of the Kansas City Star Editorial Board. But our experience in the justice system is different than mainstream Americans or white folks. And one of the things that the family talked about, if this was a black kid who had struck a white person or a white girl with a pipe, that kid would still be in juvenile right now until their hearing. Why did you decide, first of all, how did you respond to criticism about race playing a factor? And what made you decide to send the kid home on bond under house release?
Well, first of all, I don't send them home on bond. We make recommendations. And it's the court that ultimately decides whether or not that person is remaining in custody or being sent home. I will say, one of the things I asked the head of my juvenile unit to look at was, in like circumstances, are we consistent, right? Mm-hmm. And so we looked at those like circumstances for kids in that age group, and I will say we're pretty consistent about what happens in those situations. So putting this kid back home on house arrest is not out of the norm from what is being done in the juvenile system here in Johnson County. Now, I can't speak for other jurisdictions, but I can tell you from our review of our records, that is consistent. And the other reason, Toriano, why we did that is we wanted to make sure that our recommendations were consistent with what we have done in the past, and whether or not there was any disparity between, whether or not the victim or the suspect was, of a minority or white. And again, our review of our records of similar situations this was consistent with what we've done in the past.
Steve, opening it up to other topics in our discussion, I know a woman whose car was stolen out of her driveway in Olathe a few days ago, and she got the impression from police that there's a particular wave of that going on. Have you heard anything about stepped up activity by car thieves in Johnson County?
Well, I will tell you that we had some organized groups that were hitting dealerships and hitting us hard, and it wasn't just in Johnson County, but through the metro. And we were able to capture some of the individuals involved in that, and it has slowed things down, but it was causing considerable damage to the dealerships throughout the metropolitan area. And I will tell you, in regards to just the random car burglaries or car thefts that we see throughout the county, that is a constant issue. And one of the things I always tell citizens is the quickest way or the best way for you to avoid having your car broken into is don't leave anything in the seats. Because what a lot of these folks do, and a lot of it is juveniles, they'll just go down the street, and if there's something in the seat, they're going to steal it. If it's an empty car, they'll leave it alone. And so many times these crimes are crimes of opportunity. And that's why the police departments, you constantly see them talk about those things, about trying to reinforce, take your stuff in, don't leave them inside the car, because that makes you a target. Toriano, before we go too far, you had asked about the sentences. And one of the things that I will say, our JCAB, which is, we have a Criminal Justice Advisory Council. And one of the subgroups is JCAB, which they look at juvenile justice and what we're doing. And we have for, I think it's been over 5 years now, worked on, is there a disparity with minorities in our juvenile justice system? So we've had a long-term review of that. And in fact, we had a organization review our data. And so the purpose of that is to make sure that we are being consistent in following those recommendations. And that included, arrest. Are there disparities there? Is there disparities in our dispositions and what we're doing? So I do think it's important for us to review these things to make sure that we aren't doing that. And, the thing about bias is it can be sneaky. It can be something that you're not aware that is actually happening. And so it's important to review this data. And we're lucky because we have the Justice Information Management System in Johnson County, and it provides us really good data so we can report back. And I will say that this research, we do have individuals from the NAACP that participate in that group and review the data with us. And they've also made some recommendations, so we tweak things along the way. So I think your point's well taken. It doesn't hurt for us to examine those things to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And it's kind of a subliminal type bias that's going on that you don't even know about. So I think it's important for us to review it. And I'm glad you brought that up. And I wanted to add that we are addressing this and have done that for some time. Appreciate
that, DA. National news, I'm going to try to tie it in locally here. In Louisville, Kentucky, word is that the Breonna Taylor case, the DA has indicted police officers for wanton endangerment. You've had your dealings with officer-involved shootings. As a prosecutor, can you take us through some of the steps that you would go through in presenting a case to the grand jury involving an officer-involved shooting?
Yeah, well, first of all, we don't use a grand jury system because, the thing about grand juries is after the grand jury finds a true bill, guess who has to handle the case? It's the prosecutor.
Yeah.
So I just feel like that's an unnecessary step. If I'm going to be the one trying a case, I should be making decisions on what the charges are and what's going on. You know, we were way ahead of the game in how we approach those officer-involved shootings. Back in 2005, we started the officer-involved shooting incident team, and we were way ahead our time at that point, where we have independent an investigation. We don't have police departments investigating their own. So these are officers who belong to other agencies that are really, honestly, the best of the best. They have to apply for and be accepted by the chiefs of police, myself, and the sheriff, that they are qualified enough to be on that team. And they're experienced officers. So they do the investigation, and then what happens is they then present the investigation to my office for review. And then at that point, we review the case just like any other criminal case and make a determination of whether or not there was a reason to use deadly force. And so I think it's important in Kansas, we have a number of self-defense laws that apply to not just police officers, but all citizens. And your right to use self-defense or use deadly force in self-defense. And so you have to apply that statute, and then you have to apply Kansas case law and make a determination of whether or not it is reasonable for that person to use force in that manner to protect themselves or protect others. And so that's the critical analysis that I make as district attorney. And then we have a series of things that we try to do to be transparent about what that decision means and why we did it. But it's interesting. Some jurisdictions like to use grand juries. Frankly, I look at it this way. The people elect me to make those decisions. And to me, it's hiding behind the grand jury. And I just look at it like, if I can't stand up before you in a press conference and explain why I did what I did, then maybe I made the wrong decision.
Yeah.
So I'm just a big believer in making the decision myself.
Yeah. And that was going to be my follow-up question. I'm glad you touched on that. I was going to ask you, do prosecutors use the grand jury as a cop-out, not to face the heat?
Yep, absolutely. And, you know, we're blessed with having a great law enforcement community in Johnson County. We have really well-run organizations, but that doesn't mean you don't have bad officers. It's just like any type of employment, you got bad eggs that you got to deal with. You know, there's bad lawyers. And so the important thing is to recognize who they are and don't keep them around. And I will tell you, in Johnson County, if you're a bad cop or if you have bad ethics or you mistreat people, they have no tolerance for it, and you're gone. And
I was going to ask, have you indicted a police officer in your time in office?
Oh yeah, we unfortunately I've had to do probably, in the 12 years I've been DA, there's dozens of police officers who've been charged with domestic violence, some of them really serious felonies, DUIs. We've had thefts. You know, we discharged an officer with prostitution the other day.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, what people expect out of me is the officer should be treated like any other citizen. And it's important because I took an oath of office to uphold the Constitution of the state of Kansas and the United States. And I always harken back to, if you look at Lady Justice, what does Lady Justice have on? A blindfold.
Mm.
And Lady Justice, the blindfold represents that it doesn't matter who you are, how wealthy you are, your race, your religion, you should be treated the same. And we talk about those ethics in my office quite a bit, about we should always be talking about being fair and just, because if we don't, the system fails. And people losing their I guess, their faith in the system.
And I was going to say, what would you say to those people who feel like sometimes Lady Justice just isn't just?
You know, I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you across this country that it doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. That, you know, people who are wealthy or have a lot of influence get treated differently than maybe somebody who is not. But I will tell you, just from my personal standpoint, as a prosecutor of 30 years, if someone has been grown up with a silver spoon in their mouth and had everything given to them that shouldn't allow them to be successful, and they turn around and commit crime, I have far less sympathy for them than somebody who maybe has grown up in the urban core and their parents maybe are incarcerated or they've had a really troubled family life. I have sympathy for that person because that person had a difficult road to get out of. And so if I was going to give any credence to anybody, it would be that person versus the one who had the silver spoon, who has no excuse for their criminal conduct. And so, but we talk about ethics. We talk about, we had this discussion the other day with a bunch of my lawyers. The last thing we ever look at is what is the color of the person's skin. I mean, we don't care when we file our cases that just doesn't go into our equation. But it's important that from me as leadership that I push that's important. And the other thing I'm very proud of as my time as DEA has gone on, we've gotten more diversity in my office. And I think that's also important because it gives you a perspective from somebody who's maybe had a different background or life. And so, I've got some African-American employees, and I think that's valuable. And I think it's also helpful in certain cases to look across the desk and see somebody that maybe would better understand who you are. It's kind of like when you have sex crime cases, sometimes having a female prosecutor makes the female victim more comfortable. And so I think that's why we've always tried to push for more diversity with my lawyers and my support staff, because I think we can provide greater assistance and connection with those people.
Steve, rural Johnson County, of all places, has had a problem lately with stray bullets, which is a fascinating thing to me. But, one family reported that there were bullets shot into their house from a neighboring property while they were gone that very well could have hit them or their children. And there's a case or two making its way into the courts. Can you tell me anything about those and about the issue itself?
Yeah, I would say that easily we're starting to get it as Johnson County continues to grow and becomes a bigger urban center, that we're starting to deal with the issues where you get more and more people brushing up against rural areas in the county. And, if people use their guns and use them safely, it's really not an issue. And, the problem is occasionally you can't always control where ricochets go. And it becomes somewhat problematic. And I know the county is wrestling with what kind of things can you do, because under Kansas law, you have a right to carry. You have a right to possess a weapon. And in some of the unincorporated areas, you have a right to shoot the gun, but can they put restrictions in place? And it is not as easy as you would think to try to construct something that makes sense, keeps people safe, but at the same time allows people to responsibly use their firearms. And so I know our county legal department is wrestling with that issue, and I wish I could give you a real easy answer to what we're going to do, but it's going to be difficult. And, you just don't want a tragic situation to happen. And we've had a few close calls, and so it's important that we reinforce proper safety and safeguards, but at the same time respect people's rights to safely use firearms.
Do you have any cases that are prosecutable in your office? I mean, do you think there's something that can be done about these particular cases?
We have one case that is pending right now in our court where a vehicle was struck going down the road. But those are difficult cases to resolve. And, the other thing is, you never have a situation where someone intends to hurt somebody, right? It's more about recklessness, being reckless or negligent. And so that's why those are very difficult cases to deal with. And so, again, I wish I had a really easy answer, and that's something that we're working with the county counselor's office to see if we can put together something that makes sense for everybody.
And DA, sorry, Michael, go ahead, Michael. I'm sorry.
Well, I just wanted to hit another issue real quickly. We talked about officer-involved shootings. The Albert family in Overland Park, I think it is, had a situation where their son was killed in an officer-involved shooting. And apparently there's a continued frustration on the part of the family at getting investigatory information from the files. Is there more than you could that you could release from the files now that the case is over?
Well, in the Open Records Act, it is restrictive in that area for a couple of reasons. But I will say, I mean, they had filed a lawsuit, so they would have had the opportunity to get that same discovery through their lawsuit. And I don't know why that wasn't accomplished, but that was a mechanism for them to get what they have been asking for. But in regards to the Open Records Act, the trouble thing for me, Michael, is if I open it up to one person, I got to open it up to everybody. And that's the concern I have, because in many of these tragic situations, you're dealing with people's medical records. You're dealing with very personal information. You're dealing with people providing candid comments, witnesses, and people associated with the victim and others. And so it's really important for us to be mindful of the fact that if I give it to you, Michael Ryan, as a reporter, I have faith that you have some ethics, that you're not going to just turn over and put on the web all this privileged information, right? But if I give it to you, I got to give it to everybody, including Johnny, who lives down in the basement of his parents' house, who's a blogger. And so there's no faith in him not just releasing all this personal information out into the web. Now, the Kansas statutes have been amended to provide greater access to things like videos. So an affected family has the opportunity to view videos, either car cameras or person cameras, of the incident. And that's their right under Kansas law. And those things are provided to individuals. But as far as just opening up everything, that's troubling for me because of the personal information in there. Plus, it names what people say. We've had instances where we've had witnesses say something and it's their neighbors. Well, then they find out what their neighbor said about them. And so it creates a lot of tension, and something that, while I understand the concerns, there is a mechanism to get those documents. And I also have to be respectful of everybody's privacy. And so I understand the concerns about that. I just wish that we could find a middle ground, maybe under Kansas law, and maybe, provide some mechanism for some protective orders where maybe people can have access, but it's under a court protective order. And then if they don't comply, or if they do produce it to third parties, they would be in contempt of court. There's a mechanism there that you could do something to satisfy people, but it's not an easy solution. And so that's the reason why I feel very hesitant about just opening it up everything, because I think it's counterproductive to people's privacy rights. We got HIPAA laws, so I'm just going to turn over all that information to the entire web. I don't think that's the right thing to do.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time this afternoon. We want to thank Johnson County DA Steve Howe for joining us. Once again, I'm Toriano Porter. For my colleague Michael Ryan, special guest Steve Howe, thank you for joining us this afternoon for another edition of Star Opinion Live. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir.